Welcome to Far East Wargaming, bringing you another Heresy Thursday. I'm your host Richard again this week, and we have Jason joining us.
Hello, everybody.
And today we're going to be doing our third and final part on the Siege of Cthonia book, and we're going to be looking at the Onslaught Campaign rules, as well as the 5 new core missions that they've added with this new release.
Yeah, there's a lot to digest here, whether it's the campaign rule system or the missions themselves. We'll dive into each one of these different sections. Before we get started, probably I would say that campaigns were one of my favorite things in the black books. We've tried to actually do a couple of them here locally. They add a lot of flavor. If you haven't been familiar with the campaign system in the black books, they're very thematic. So it's not meant to be competitive, and many times the campaign rules and the mission rules themselves in the black books, they were unbalanced because you were recreating significant events from the novels. This is no different. So keep that kind of in the back of your mind when we dive into this whole campaign system that's now available to us.
Yeah, I think what I'm finding from this, and like I said, we'll dive into it, is that they're giving us a framework to use in the Siege of Cthonia missions, but also potentially for them or ourselves to adapt to the previous Black Book missions to a campaign. And the core side of things is trying to be balanced, I'll say, but the Apex missions, the specific Siege of Cthonia missions between the Sons of Horus and the Iron Warrior, Imperial Fists, is the more unbalanced side of things. But diving in, we're talking about the new Onslaught Campaign system. So this system here is designed for 2 players or 2 teams of multiple players to play. And it's taking an interesting approach for how to do it, bringing in some aspects of what they did in 40k with some stratagems, but also a uncertain number of games to be played.
Yeah, this one's a little weird to me. I get the thinking here, right? You're giving a framework where people can know kind of an idea of how many how many games you're going to play. But theoretically, the whole campaign could be over if one side wins or one player wins 2 games, right? And now the likelihood isn't huge, but I mean, if you look in the rule book and you see this table for seize the moment rolls, this essentially defines when the campaign ends, and it can be triggered when one player reaches even 1 win, right? 1 versus 0, you could possibly have only one more game after that, which would be an Apex game. So, interesting. I mean, and I think this is kind of optional in my mind, right? Because if we're running a campaign, then, and especially with multiple players, you're going to be playing a lot of games. Okay, I get it, but I also don't think it was necessary, to be quite honest with you. I think you and your group can just define how many games you want to play through a campaign.
Yep. So again, these are suggestions that I don't think you have to follow them by the letter of the law per se, but the seize the moment roles is an interesting side. I think it will be applied more to 2-player campaigns as opposed to multiplayer campaigns there. And if we are doing a multiplayer campaign, I think you'd classify a win as the whole group playing 1 round, and whichever side had the most victories is the winner of that round. So as opposed to wins, you'd probably just do them as rounds there. So each player at least gets to play something in a multi-person or team-based campaign before you get to the decisive battle, which is whoever seizes the moment there and tries to end it. And then again, I think they even suggest that in the decisive battle, everybody should play a decisive battle, and the winner is the one with the most decisive battle. So nice to add, but could do with some refining, because I think you're right. There is a chance, a very slim chance on a 6+, but on a roll of a 6, after the first game, you're already into the decisive battles for the second game. It would be a very unfulfilling campaign.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and like everything else, modify to your own taste. There's nothing stopping you from doing whatever you want to do here. I do like that there's a little bit, again, of structure and thinking, but I don't know. We'll see if we use it ourselves. And I think probably it's worth talking about here. I mean, after the teams or the players are selected for the campaign, one of the very first things that you need to do is select these campaign stratagems. And to your point, this is kind of getting back towards 40k or, things of this nature. And some of these stratagems are interesting. Maybe we can take a little time reviewing one by one.
Yeah, I'm of mixed opinion for stratagems. Just in general, they're gotcha. The one saving grace I can say is I don't think any of these ones are too overpowered to be used. But the way it works is that at the start of the campaign, each side, the loyalists and the traitors, get to choose 4 stratagems. And these stratagems can be used at any time and any number in a given game, but only ever used once. So I think this comes into more playing multiplayer team battles, where you have to really vie amongst yourselves when or who gets to use these stratagems. And again, it adds a bit of strategy, hence stratagems, to this. But if we look at the first one, it's big guns never tire, and the player who uses this stratagem can include an additional heavy support choice. And that's actually pretty strong, considering heavy support is something that is limiting us in current games, but adding an extra one is nice.
Yeah, I like this one actually. I don't think it's too crazy, and I think for some legions it's going to be incredibly helpful, because if you think about it, there's certain rights of war for certain legions that they're only allowed a set number of heavy support choices. So this opens up a little bit more variety for them. I do see how this could be abused a little bit, because let's face it, some of the most powerful choices in any legion list are in heavy support, and somebody being able to load up on 4 of them now could potentially be a little bit, unbalanced if you're that guy. But overall, no, I don't think this one's particularly bad, and it does open up a little bit more, I think, variety in terms of what's available.
Yeah, the one thing that I find very strange about this stratagem in particular is that the campaigns what you're supposed to play for the Siege of Cthonia, there's a limited point size of 3,000, and you're supposed to select your entire legion and army composition at the beginning. So being able to add another heavy support choice, does it allow you to fully modify your list, or I don't know how you'd actually apply it.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? Because you are absolutely correct. You're supposed to have your list defined before the campaign ever starts. Uh, does this open that up? I don't know. Yeah, that's really interesting, and probably something that may have used either an extra paragraph or line or something in an FAQ, if they're going to choose to do any sort of FAQs for these campaign systems.
The second stratagem that's available is called Force March, and the player that uses this stratagem may shift their deployment zone up to 6 inches in one direction. So it doesn't allow you to expand multiple deployment zones for certain of the deployment zone setups. And if both players do this, you have to roll off to see who does it first. I like this. This is 6 inches of extra deployment zone, moving you further up the field. Could really help certain armies.
Oh, big time. I mean, if you have an assault army, this gets you 6 inches closer to the enemy. Even better if you're going first. If you are, playing an objective-based mission, and most of the missions are objective-based, you could potentially put yourself even closer to some of those objectives by playing this particular stratagem. Yeah, this is nice, and I think it, again, will favor some legions over others, but I can see this one getting a lot of use, and I don't think it's OP. But yeah, it's a good one. Interesting.
I think used at the right time, it could really sway a battle. But again, it really depends when is the right time and against whom. So yeah, I do like it, but again, not overpowered. The third one is Lightning Strike. And what this allows is basically whoever uses this stratagem, their reserve rolls come on a 2+ instead of a 3+. I like it. I like it a lot. It's helpful. It's, again, not too overpowered, and it just gives you a bit of extra.
Yeah, it's going to favor certain rights of war, certain legions that may want to take advantage of reserves. In addition to being able to come in on a 2+, you can choose to come in automatically on turn 3 instead of the normal turn 4. I can understand actually why they did that, because these new core missions in this book are mostly recommended to be played at 4 turns. Yeah, again, this is it's not going to be usable by everybody, but certain lists, certain rights of war are going to really make use of that one.
Well, that's actually a very good point. If you are going for a reserve-heavy list, they've not changed the turns reserves come in on for the campaigns. So potentially, if you're unlucky and you're rolling 2s and 1s for your reserve rolls, you could come in only on the last turn of the game and really not do much.
Yes, and it also frees up points if you think about it, because why do people take things like, a command rhino or other ways to affect their reserve rolls? You know, I'll no longer have that points tax to be worrying about if you plan on using this particular stratagem.
The next stratagem is actually following along for that. It's called No Surrender. And what this allows is at the end of the fourth turn, of the standard turns of the battle, you can choose to play an additional fifth turn. And on top of that, all your units become fearless for that turn. So this here, I think, of all of the ones we've talked to so far, is probably more overpowered, but both sides get the advantage of that extra turn, but only one side gets fearless.
Yeah, this kind of gets back to the 1.0 rules for the Imperial Fists and the Iron Warriors, where your opponent can play extra turns. The combination with Fearless is really powerful for the activating player, the one that has this. What's also perhaps a little bit unclear is if you're playing other missions as part of your campaign system that are not 4 turns based. I mean, theoretically, you could go to a 6th or a 7th turn, right? So yes, it has a lot of power, and this is probably the one that I think could be the closest to maybe being a little bit, I don't want to say broken, but OP of the stratagems that we've reviewed so far.
That's a good point. I can see the potential of, unlikely, but the potential of a 7th turn if you're playing the 6-turn missions and you manage to get that 6th turn and then you activate this to get the 7th turn. Could make a very long game. But yeah, it's, I think, very deciding because the extra turns allows you, one, to score more points, and for some of the games, the victory points increase as the turns go on, so it could really be deciding there. And just generally, I think we're both in agreement that 4 turns is just a bit too few for a mission.
Yeah, we'll talk about that when we review the missions themselves, but I think 4 turns is way too short unless you're playing something like a small ZM game. But yeah, I don't want to jump too far ahead of us, but I think really 5, in my opinion, is the sweet spot. Or if you're going to do 4 turns, then at least the rules have the option for a 5th turn on X roll, right?
The last campaign stratagem is a fluffy one. It's called Master of the Crusade, but it does suffer a bit from the same faults we saw in Big Guns Never Tire, because what this does is allow you to use a Primarch without the points limitation. So you can throw a Primarch in regardless of your points. But it harks down to, again, you've already chosen your armies for the campaign. Here you're changing it up, adding a Primarch into this. How to go about doing that, or how to go about solving that problem.
This one, in my mind, is actually open to abuse because the FAQ actually clarified that if you select a Primarch and you take a retinue and you take a dedicated transport, all those points add up to the 25% limit. Put it into your list. So this stratagem now basically throws all that out of the window, where people can bring really nasty Primarch Death Stars and not have to worry about the points versus that limitation. Yeah, it could be abused. I think if you're using it for fluffy purposes, having a Primarch show up in a smaller points battle because you're trying to recreate something from a novel or something like that, then yeah, it's a cool one. But more of our competitive player base may actually use this to abuse that system and bring some really, really powerful Death Stars. And actually, that's not even the last of the core stratagems. It seems that there's quite a few more on the next page.
Oh yes, sorry, I am jumping ahead of myself there. I can definitely see what you're saying for the Master of the Crusades getting abused there, especially, for instance, in a decisive battle where the person who is getting the decisive battle suddenly brings in this Death Star that you're not equipped to deal with and likely to lose a decisive battle.
Yeah, of course. And when you're playing with your friends, and you're playing something like a campaign, then it tends to be a lot more friendly, right? And that's the theme of most of the campaign systems that we've ever seen in 30K. They're narrative, they're fun, they're fluffy. I don't know. I just strive not to be that guy, but I can recognize how this one could be open for that guy to use.
So, as you're saying, moving on to the second page of the stratagems, Renewed Zeal. This is, I think, pretty strong because whoever declares the stratagem can't be pinned. So if you're normally pinned, you just move d6 plus 1 inches towards the nearest enemy unit. Pinning is such a large thing in Horus Heresy in our current edition that the ability to not be pinned and potentially even move closer to the target is pretty strong.
Oh, this is brutal. And what I mean by that is Librarian, pinning Librarian, Nemesis Bolter Spam, Rotor Cannons. I mean, there's certain armies that rely a lot on pinning, and you can effectively just shut that mechanic off. That's really, really, really strong. Now, there is the bit of the downside of moving towards the enemy, right? Because maybe you don't want some of your units moving towards the enemy instead of being pinned. So there is a little bit of a downside to it. But if you're playing a very aggressive or an assault-oriented army, this is magnificent because you are going to be ignoring the pinning effects. You are going to be getting artificially closer to the enemy. That's a good thing. So this one's a really, really strong one.
We've also got something called the Perfect Ground. Now, for us at Far East Wargaming, this actually doesn't come into play that much because of the way we place terrain. But what this does is it allows the person using this stratagem to have full control of how the terrain is placed, as opposed to in how you're supposed to do it, where you choose the terrain pieces and then you alternate.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. It doesn't come up too much in our games, and we try to set terrain to be interesting, to be thematic, to be not totally balanced because, perfectly asymmetrical tables are quite boring. But this one could also be abused in the wrong hands, right? If I've got a massively shooty gun line army, I can effectively force you to play in a parking lot. Or if I've got an assault army, I can effectively make it so that I have tons of line of sight blocking terrain and virtually guarantee that I can get to you unmolested. Again, it can be open for abuse, but we don't really use this one too much. I don't see it coming up.
Moving on, we've got Remembrancer Corpse. So what this allows is that every time you score a victory point, you roll a d6, and on a 4+, you actually gain an additional victory point. So in some missions, actually could be a large difference maker.
Massive difference maker. These new core missions have a lot more secondaries. I think there's 5 secondaries now that are the standard for these particular core missions in the Cthonia book. And generating extra VP essentially for free is very, very strong. I think this is going to be, if you're playing a campaign, you're going to probably see this one used a lot because it's just extra free points. So why not?
Moving on, we've also got Into Hell's Heart, and this allows for deep striking units to not deviate when you use this stratagem here. I can see this being done in conjunction with something like Lightning Strike, really to guarantee your units in reserve come in early and on target.
Super powerful. I mean, remember, a lot of deep striking triggers pinning checks. And the fact that you can essentially ignore any sort of deviation off target means you can potentially pin massive amounts of the opponent's army just because you know exactly where you're going to come in at. Very, very, very strong. Those kinds of lists that are going to be using a lot of reserves, I can see this one being a very popular choice as well.
Now, the final one, the real final one, is called the First Cut. And so this one here allows whoever activates the stratagem to choose who deploys first.
Yeah, well, it's not only deploy first, but it's also who takes the first turn. And I think this is a good reason why they've probably limited these stratagems where they're only once per campaign, and you can't just keep abusing this one over and over and over again. Because determining who deploys first, goes first is incredibly strong. Super, super, super strong. Again, very shooty armies, very assaulty armies will have that certainty, and it's kind of taking the randomness out of the game system away. I see this as another very popular choice in the campaign system.
So that sums up the stratagems there that you can select. And as we said, you can select 4 of them, and they can be used once during the entire Onslaught campaign. There's also some other Onslaught optional rules, and I like these ones. The first one is character casualties. And this is fluffy in the sense that you're Warlord, and if you've chosen any unique subtypes, so unique characters, if they are killed in a game, There's a chance for slim chance for them to actually be mortally wounded, or there's a chance for them to get some extra bonuses here.
Yeah, I like these too. I think fatalities and wounding and these kinds of things on your characters is a nice mechanic to have in campaign systems. This is going to make you taking care of your unique characters a must, right? Because if you've got a big risk of, let's say, you're running Siggy for the Imperial Fists, you're basically taking a chance if he ever dies in game that he dies for the entire campaign. So you just have to be a little bit smart in terms of how you use your models. The one piece that's actually a little bit unclear as well is what happens if somebody is mortally wounded, for example. Since you're supposed to set your list before the campaign starts, does this mean you get to revise your list and put those points on something else? It's a little bit unclear, I would say, in that perspective. So you probably need to have a little bit of a discussion or a house rule with your campaign group to determine how you would address that kind of situation should it come up. But I think overall, having character fatalities, character wounds, these kinds of things is a really good mechanic to use in your games, and it makes it just a little bit more interesting.
Yeah, so actually there are several, results on the fatality table. The first one, if you roll a 1, you are mortally wounded, and the opponent gets a +1 for the seize the moment, which is to find out with the decisive battle there. So really doubling up on the penalty there. You're losing your warlord or unique character, and there's a potential to call the end of the game or the end of the campaign. On a 2 to 3, you have something called badly hurt. And what this does is it takes your wound characteristic down by 1 for the next battle. And subsequent battles, you're back to normal. Losing a wound is never good.
Yeah, no, it's not. But I mean, it makes sense. It's fluffy, right? He's been wounded. He's playing in the next battle. The apothecaries haven't been able to attend to him properly. Yeah, I think that's cool. I mean, and the next one, Shaken, is very similar, but instead it affects your leadership characteristics. So that could be quite tough to deal with as well, especially if you're not using somebody with a leadership 10. All of a sudden, your leadership 9 Delegatus goes down to an 8. But again, I think they add flavor. You just have to be smart in how you use your warlords. And some of the more cowardly players amongst us might actually start refusing challenges and stuff like that. But I mean, that's fine. I don't think necessarily that's a bad thing.
Yeah, Shaken actually is a bit worse than badly hurt in terms of it's not for one game, it's until you win. So if you keep losing, you're going to maintain that leadership characteristic negative effect here. On a 6th, you're unscathed, but the fun one is actually on a 7. And how do you get a 7? Because if you lost your character but you did win the game, you get +1 to all of these results. So if you've won the game and on a roll of a 6, you score a 7, you become hungry for revenge, and that gives you an extra attack for the next game.
Yeah, cool, very cool. And the limitation is it's only for the next game and not for the rest of the campaign, so that does balance it out a little bit. I like it. A bit of a positive to the fatality table rather than the negatives that you see elsewhere.
Another optional rule is these battlefield achievements, and these are adding to the ease of successfully getting a seize the moment.
Yeah, I like this. It encourages more than just playing strictly the missions or just strictly trying to kill your opponent, and that's something that we actually try to do in our event that we have, where we have these kind of narrative objectives in each of the missions to encourage players to do really heroic things, to do different things. Yeah, I think this adds flavor. Nothing sticks out as particularly broken or, again, because it only affects the seize the moment roll. If these were some sort of army-wide effects through the entire campaign or something like that, then I might have a bit of a more raised eyebrow. But no, I think they add flavor. And again, they encourage you to really kind of focus on the campaign and the story and the narrative. And I think that's interesting.
Yep, and these battlefield achievements, if you do meet the criteria, can actually stack. So the first one is overwhelming victory, and this what allows you to do is to roll an additional dice when trying to seize the moment. So it's like a reroll basically, and you choose the result you want. So actually, it could be allowing you to choose not to win the decisive battle and keep the campaign going, which is an interesting point of view.
Yeah, it is. I think probably what's a little unclear also, just with these rules in general, is what if you have a team, right? What if What if you're playing a team event and there's multiple overwhelming victories or multiple battlefield superiority or Pyrrhic victories? It just talks about winning player and it doesn't talk about winning side. So you probably, again, have to talk about that with your campaign group on when these trigger.
Yeah, again, we're finding that even though they are saying it's for team-based or can be used for team-based, they've really not flushed out the rules of how to go about initiating that.
Yeah, and I think it's a common comment if you actually think about everything that we've reviewed in this book so far. There just seems to be a feel like either things were not fully written out, or there was perhaps not as good or as deep of editing when some of these sections were written. Because you find yourself kind of going back and forth thinking, well, is this how they intended it or not? And you have to reread certain sections over and over again to make sure you get it right. Or you reread something over and over and over again and it still just doesn't make sense and you need to talk to your group and kind of walk through it. My beef with this book is that point exactly. We really shouldn't have to do this so much. And I think this is just another example of, let's put a little bit more thought process, I think, into the editing and the whatnot to avoid these kind of ambiguous situations.
The second battlefield achievement is something called Undaunted, and if you're successful in this, you get +1 to your roll for the Seize the Moment. And to accomplish this battlefield achievement, you have to kill all enemy models that have the Primarch, Unique, Super Heavy, Knights, or Titans in the army. So I think the part that will come into play most is the unique aspect, because Primarch, Super Heavies, Titans, and Knights are less common on the battlefield.
Yeah, it's kind of cool, right? Your army decides that we need to go take out the head of the snake, the Primarch, or we need to get rid of that one unique character. And again, it does encourage a different kind of play style rather than just focusing on the mission itself. I like it. It's cool.
The third achievement is called Battlefield Superiority, and this is actually very close to Overwhelming Victory here, and it's actually a bit more achievable because if at the end of the battle, at least half of your units in the victor's army are still on the battlefield and not removed as casualties, you can re-roll your Seize the Moment dice. Now, this can stack, for instance, with Overwhelming Victory, so you could be rolling 2 dice and re-roll one of them there. So again, the stackability allows a lot of potential wins.
Yeah, I would almost rather have overwhelming victory, to be honest with you, because it's more flexible. This allows you to roll an extra dice and select it to determine the result. So if you didn't want to have, the Apex mission, the Seize the Moment, you could actually decline it by rolling 2 dice and taking the lower of the 2, for example. But yeah, this is your reroll if you decide to choose, and you're right, both of them could technically be triggered in the same game.
The final achievement, and I'm gonna probably butcher the name here, is called Pyrrhic Victory. And this one here is just a bit strange in the way it's worded and what it actually does.
Yeah, Pyrrhic. Yeah, I'm an American, so we butcher the pronunciation on all of these kinds of things. But this one's weird. I mean, it just says that basically if you have the same number of victory points and then there's a tiebreaker of any kind, then that player counts as the victor, fulfills this battlefield achievement. And the battlefield achievement is you roll an extra dice with the Seize the Moment roll and select the lowest result. I don't know. Maybe I'm just simple-minded, but I don't really get this particular achievement.
I'm on the same boat with you there. I don't really know what the tiebreaker is about. Do you have to have a winner if you've scored the same number of victory points? I don't think that's in any of the that I've seen written in any of the rules.
Yeah, I mean, leave a comment if you know differently, but this one just seems really strange. I almost don't know why this one is included.
And then on from Onslaught optional rules, you actually have Siege of Cthonia optional rules. And these ones are really very Legion specific. And there's 3 of them here. And one is for the Imperial Fist, one is for the Sons of Horus, and one applies to Demons and Psychers.
Yeah, these are only going to be specific for those legions. So yeah, if you're playing a dedicated campaign with the Sons of Horus and Imperial Fist, then great. Some of these can actually be quite powerful, and definitely these are fluffy choices, like the ones for the Sons of Horus. You succeed on your seize the initiative and reserve rolls much easier, making it very easy for you to get the first turn. For the Imperial Fists, you get to get free fortifications, which, depending on which fortifications you use and have in your terrain collection, could actually be very powerful as well. I don't think we really need to spend a lot of time on this particular section because it's so laser focused on just those 2 legions. But yeah, these are actually quite powerful as well.
I think the two for the Sons of Horus and the Imperial Fist are pretty scenario breaking. More so for the Imperial Fist, really, because the Sons of Horus really just get a potential to seize a reroll, then reserves on 2+. But for the Imperial Fist here, you get to put stronghold, so you get to put fortifications down. But on top of that, if you're embarked in the fortification at the end of the final game turn, you get an extra victory point.
Yeah, I mean that's really, really strong. And again, these are not intended probably to be balanced, so I get that. I mean, even the Seal of Blood, the third one that's specific here, all of a sudden you're potentially giving demon units Battle Hardened 1, Battle Hardened 2, Murderous Strike. Could be really, really nasty if you're playing with a lot of demons in your particular campaign, your particular Cthonia campaign, that is. All of these are fluffy, but again, very strong and laser focused.
So that's how to run a Onslaught campaign and the structure for running this for 2 players or team based. Again, I think we're in agreement that it is nice to have this structure, but it wasn't fleshed out correctly.
Yeah, a lot of confusing things, and I mean, even myself reading things over and over again, or our debates that we've had offline. Talk through all of this with your campaign group if you decide that you want to use these rules, because some of it does need, I think, a little bit of discussion and alignment beforehand.
So now if we move on to the new core missions here, these aren't campaign specific, they're actually just new core missions in addition to the 6 we had in the rules book. They've done something quite different in the structure and the sizing.
There's a couple things that stick out, right? The first thing that sticks out is if you actually look at the selecting the armies for the core missions, they're telling you that it's recommended to play it at 3,000, a limit of 3,000, which to me is very, very strange because most people say that Heresy plays best at 3,000 and above. And they're now telling you for these missions, you need to play at 3,000 or less, unless you agree differently with your play group. But okay, you've got that little disclaimer there, but it's just weird that they would want you to play at 3,000. The other thing that's very, very weird is they want you to play 4-turn games. That's one thing that all of these missions have in common, which in my mind is way too short. Wouldn't you agree with that, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, both the size and the game turns are strange decisions here. I potentially understand the combination of the two, the 3,000 point size in combination with a 4-turn game, because anything larger than that, you might not even get to play everything. Again, something we talked about in the Zone Mortalis about getting everything on the board. But in general, 4 turns isn't enough to fully complete objectives, especially objective-based missions there, and is a bit short. But they may be trying to get something again along the 40k style of missions where they want you to play these missions quickly.
Yeah, to me, this was a solution to a problem that didn't exist, right? I don't recall really very many people in the Heresy community that have been, crying for shorter games, or have been crying for smaller tables, or been crying for any of the changes that they've made to 40k. Maybe there's also a bit of a nod to the more competitive crowd in this particular set of rules or recommendations. Again, I mean, nothing is set in stone, but you just need to be prepared that if you go to an event that uses these new core missions as is, you need to plan for 4-turn games. And to me, that also puts an extra emphasis on those armies that have very nasty alpha strikes. You're playing a shorter game. Why not build a list that's designed to just remove half of the opponent's army in turn 1? Not my favorite thing. playing more competitive Heresy. I get it. It's a thing. There's no wrong way to play. Totally supportive of all of that. But you just need to be aware on these core missions of that big change, because that is very significant.
Yeah, it really does penalize the less maneuverable armies and force you to take transports more just to get about the board in those 4 turns. And going on to what you were saying about not the need for 4-turn games. For us, we've been playing Heresy for a while now, so we do know our armies and we can get a relatively short game in. And even for the tournaments we run at Far East Wargaming, we can get 3 games out in a day, setting, well, smaller point sizes, yes, but playing the full 5 turns. And I think it's more fulfilling for the players.
Yeah, it is, right? It absolutely is. And there's even some of the missions that we've played in our events that go 6 turns. And you already have a system to play smaller, shorter games if you want, and that's called Zone Mortalis, right? So I mean, I get it. It's extra definition. It's probably designed to play faster. It's probably designed to favor a more competitive style of missions. I just don't think it was a problem that we needed a solution to. I really don't. The other thing about selecting armies, and it's clearly written here in case you had any question about it, they're telling you your warlord traits, your rites of war, psychic disciplines, all of that needs to actually be selected on your roster before you get to a game, before you know what the mission is, before you know any of these kinds of things. Just in case you had any question before, it's now there in writing. That's what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, and that moves away from how we normally do it in the more friendly games or the more friendly setups, where we see what the mission is, we see how the terrain is, and our warlord traits and like psychic abilities can potentially change due to that. I think they're trying to standardize this very much along the lines of competition based, where you can't debate this. It's written at the very beginning what we're doing, and I can't change it to give an advantage to myself in this particular game.
Yep.
Also, what's strange about it is the Force Org chart hasn't changed at all. They've kept the exact number of Force Orgs, but limited the points to 3,000. And at 3,000 points, the Force Org is perfectly adequate there. So if I was limiting to it, if I wanted to add more, I would have removed some of the things. For instance, the number of elites, the total number of troop choices and such. But they've kept everything standard whilst just saying that 3,000 is the max you can go, as if it would really make any difference.
Yeah. I don't know why. Again, it's more solutions to problems that we don't have. Yeah, I don't know why that's written the way it is and why they've limited the points and everything, but we can only hazard a guess, I think.
They have kept some things standard. They've kept the deployment zones to 3, Hammer and Anvil, which is short edge deployments, 24 inches. Dawn of War, which is one we see the most probably, which is the long edges, 12-inch deployment zones. And Search and Destroy, which is quarters with an 18-inch bubble in the middle of the field that's not allowed to be deployed. And a recurring theme here for all these new missions is they're all objective based, whether that be 1 or 6 objectives here. So differing from how we played the 6 core missions, where some of them were objective based, one of them was kill everything on the board, and a couple of them were zone objectives.
Yeah, we went from 6 deployments in the standard rulebook down to these 3. I don't think anybody is going to miss the ambush deployment, where one unfortunate player had everything stuck in the middle of the table in a circle and was surrounded by his opponent. I don't think anybody's going to miss that. But I think they very easily could have gone down to the other 5 deployments and been perfectly fine. These 3 tend to be probably the most popular, so I guess there is that. But yeah, again, I don't know why we're doing this. And again, going down to these 5 core missions, none of them are necessarily particularly bad missions per se. And we do have now more rules that we'll talk about in a moment when it comes to terrain reserves, the secondaries. It's just strange, right? very strange, these modifications to me.
Yeah, they've gone into some detail about placing terrain and the number of terrain pieces you should have. 2 large area pieces of terrain, no bigger than 6 inches by 6 inches for this. Or other terrain, 6 terrain features, and no fortifications should be allowed. So I don't know. I don't know. I don't like really when the rules dictate the terrain, because it does limit it for people who don't have much terrain or only have a small selection of a different type. I love the terrain building and the terrain placement side of this game because it doesn't have to be so even and so fair. You get to use a lot of beautiful terrain that's thematic, following the boards. Here at Far East Wargamer, we have, luckily, a large selection of board types and terrain types, and we love to see them on the table regardless of their density or what is there.
Yeah, I actually have just a slightly different take on this, because I do think it's good that there is some recommendations here, and they did write this section as recommendations or optional, so there is that. 30K plays best on tables with a decent amount of terrain. It does, right? And it's a very deadly game in terms of the shooting and things like this. So if you're not playing on a table that has decent amounts of terrain of varied types, you're really kind of taking away a bit of the flavor of the game, in my opinion. So I do like the fact that they've defined some of these things in terms of size and number. So to me, it's better to have a minimum. Because again, you don't want to play on a parking lot. It's a totally different game when you play 30K like that. So I do like that particular aspect where they're telling you that you need to use more difficult terrain type pieces, some line of sight blocking pieces. What are the right sizes to be using? I mean, I think that's a good thing, because too many people in my mind do play games with not the right amount of terrain on it.
And as you were alluding to earlier, they actually changed how reserves happen. So you don't declare your reserves as you're deploying, you actually roll off once the terrain is placed. And the loser has to declare what they are deploying in deep strike, flanking assault, subterranean assault, or drop pod assault.
And that's a good thing. It does put a little bit of structure, I think. And, coming back to the point about you have to select your warlord traits, those kinds of things well before a game. I think putting a little bit of structure here is good, because that guy can be really cagey with how he declares his reserves and things like this. So in my mind, this is a bit of a good change that they're putting that structure there. So no complaints from me.
It does eliminate the potential for somebody to look at how the first player has deployed down and then suddenly changes the entire structure by putting a lot in reserves or a lot in deep strike, or removing things from deep strike because it might be disadvantageous to bring them in deep strike, especially with the proliferation of interceptor nowadays.
Yeah. So yeah, I like this. No complaints for these changes.
Another quite significant change to the core rules here is how for these missions the sudden death has been changed. In the past, sudden death gave you full victory. Now, sudden death doesn't. It just gives you an additional victory point.
Yeah, this is another thing that I like, right? Because, you could be winning a game, and this actually came up in one of our games, if you actually remember when we played Zone Mortalis. I was winning, but I was basically running away to prevent my Night Lords from getting tabled by you, right? So I do like this change. It does, force you in some ways to play the objectives rather than just trying to table your opponent. And I think that's a good thing, because so many of the missions are objective driven, and because Heresy in general is story driven. So yeah, I like this change to sudden death as well. You do still get a bonus of 1 point if you do table your opponent, but you could still lose if you're way behind on VPs at that point.
Yeah, I think that's the fact. It really encourages people to play the mission objectives as opposed to try and remove people from the board and not. So it promotes you taking line troops as opposed to just the bare minimum of 2, potentially just 2 small 5-man recon squads to satisfy that requirement there of troop choices, and going everything else elite and killy. You are likely to table your opponent, yes, because you're very effective at killing, but you're unlikely to make up the deficit in victory points.
Yeah, and I always play the objectives anyhow, and I preach this a lot, right? And again, there's no wrong way to play the game. I don't mean to say that I preach in my way is the right way, but my play style, I always try to play the objectives, and it's come up in events like Gibraltar at No Retreat, where I was playing against Matt's Ultramarines, and I knew I was going to get blasted, so I really had to focus on playing the objectives. I like that kind of play style. It fits my personality. It fits the armies that I write. And I think this rule also now really fits, that style as well.
They've also made some slight changes to secondary objectives. They've kept a few of the older ones, but they've added one or two slight modifications, which does add a bit of ambiguity to things here. So the ones they've kept are Slay the Warlord, which is pretty standard, a victory point for slaying the opponent's warlord. Giant Killer, which is killing super heavies, knights, titans. This is a variation of one of the other secondary missions.
Yeah, Slay the Warlord has been changed a little bit because not only is it now, they've basically combined two secondaries because there used to be a secondary called Price of Failure, right? Where if you lost your Primarch or you lost your Lord of War, you gave up victory points. They've now basically combined Slay the Warlord and Price of Failure into one because you do get a point for slaying the enemy warlord, but you get a bonus if it happens to be a Primarch. And then they've separated kind of Giant Killer out because many of the things that would qualify for Giant Killer are Lords of War, super heavies, knights, titans, etc. So they just basically modified those two pre-existing secondaries into these two ones here.
There's also Last Man Standing, which really hasn't changed too much there, which is an extra victory point for the player with the most units not falling back at the end of the battle. This would really stack with Sudden Death, so if you had one Sudden Death, you'd be getting Last Man Standing and the Sudden Death victory point here, so could help with the deficit, but nothing really standing out from Last Man Standing.
No, and I like that one as well. It's a good one. The next two are really strange, not strange per se. Break their ranks and First Strike. And without going into the details, essentially both of these reward you for killing stuff on turn one, right? You can score both of them by just destroying something. If you're the first player, you kill one enemy unit, you fulfill Break Their Ranks. First Strike in the first turn, once again, you fulfill this one as well. So you can actually earn a lot of bonuses by killing something in your first turn. Very, very strong. I like these, but I think they're just a little bit strange in the sense that they've created two secondaries in which they could probably have just done as one.
Yeah, it's splitting First Blood, and if I look at it, if I delve down into the math a tiny bit here, it actually is more advantageous for the player going second, purely because the player going second can do some damage most of the time in a returned fire. Now, if it kills somebody in that turn, then they get the first strike. But if it doesn't and whittles it down to a small number, in their active first turn, they can finish off that unit, get the Break Their Ranks, which is for killing a unit in your active turn, active phase of the first turn, and also First Strike for killing a unit throughout the first turn there. Whilst the person going first really has a better chance of getting just the general first strike due to potentially a return fire.
Yeah, the other interesting aspect of these two secondaries is the fact that you get a bonus if that unit was an elites or an HQ. And everybody's elite favorite tends to be a contemptor. So if I want to be really cagey and score big points on the first turn, I'm going to target a contemptor. I'm going to try and hit that thing with everything I can, because that's a lot of VP that you could actually generate off of it.
That is a good point. The saving grace, I think, is contemptors are pretty tanky, but taking a whole concentrated fire from some armies would most likely take that off the board.
Yep, absolutely. And I could have 2, 3, even potentially 4 VP if that happens.
So going on from that, we'll move into the actual missions themselves. And there's only 5 new missions as opposed to 6 in the core book, but they all follow, honestly, a very similar pattern. That being they're objective based, they are 4 turns as we discussed, and the section about deployment and who has first turn and the special mission rules, the mission special rules, are all identical across the board.
Yeah, this is so weird to me. You're absolutely right. Almost all 5 of these missions are very, very similar. Objective driven, 4 turns. They all have reserves. They all have night fighting. Um, yeah, I mean, the only mechanism that really changed is how you score the objectives. Um, I would have actually have liked to seen a little bit more variety here, right? You know, objectives that disappear more often, objectives that move more often, restrictions on how you can actually place the objectives that prevent players from just sticking them right next to their deployment zone. Um, I think this was a bit of a miss, right? Again, I mean, these missions were just too similar in my mind to really be very flavorful. And we tend to use a lot of other sources for our missions. We use the Goonhammer missions for Heresy, which I think are great. There's some great ones in the Goonhammer missions. I don't know. I don't want to accuse anybody of lazy rules writing or anything like that, right? Because I mean, I know that the rules writers and the people at GW are actually, you know, very hardworking people, and they're not trying to intentionally put out bad stuff. But these are all just so similar to each other. Why did we not have more flavor or more variety in these new core missions?
One of the major downsides I see for this is because they are core missions, so I guess they're generally supposed to be pretty balanced. But they're giving the player with strategic advantage a huge upside. Because not only do the missions that allow objectives, more than one objective to be placed, favor the strategic advantage player, because the strategic advantage player puts these markers down, and he also gets to choose his deployment zone. So as he's placing these markers down, he already knows where he's going to be deployed. So he can put it in a favorable manner there, whilst the opponent or the defender, the person without strategic advantage, doesn't really. So there's a bit of mind games going on there. But one thing you've got to bear in mind as well is the special mission rules for a night fight is only selectable by the strategic advantage player. So if you don't win strategic advantage, you potentially can't even opt for night fight if they don't want it.
Yeah, super weird. I agree totally with your observation there. I mean, strategic advantage should not be such a big deal. I mean, yes, it's good to give one player an advantage, but I come back to the same point. We're given solutions to problems that didn't exist. The way objectives were placed in the rulebook for the core missions were perfectly fine in terms of the order, how they were placed, you know, who goes first, seizing the initiative. You know, I know there's a lot of complaints out there about seizing the initiative. That one maybe you could take a look at. But the strategic advantage player being able to choose night fight only, that person. I mean, again, I don't know why they've weighted this so heavy to that player. And I could definitely see us probably house ruling some of these to not have such an advantage to that player, because it is quite powerful.
Yes. And I think we're only going to really briefly touch each of these 6 missions because there's really not much to talk about other than how the victory points are scored and the number of advantages. So if we quickly jump through this, we'll start with the first one, the new one, the Crucible of War. And this here has a total of 3 objectives, with the strategic advantage player placing 2 of them. And at the end of each of the player turns, they score a victory point for each objective marker they control. And it being 4 turns, at the end of 4 turns, the number of victory points you have plus your secondaries determines the winner. Pretty standard. Again, just more biased towards the strategic advantage player.
Ridiculous bias, right? He's placing 2. He's placing them right next to his deployment zone, which he gets to choose. He gets first turn automatically unless there's a seize the initiative. He chooses whether or not there's night fight. I mean, that's just massive advantage on that one. Big miss. in my opinion, in terms of the way that mission is structured.
The second mission is Heart of Battle, and this one is a single objective in the middle of the field, and it increases the number of victory points to 3 if you control this objective. And again, it's just 3 victory points plus secondary missions over 4 turns.
Yeah, this one is a bit more balanced. I like this one better because it's only a single objective marker and it's automatically in the middle of the table. The deployment is very similar to the core missions in the rulebook in the sense that, yes, the strategic advantage player, or the guy that wins the roll-off, gets to determine their deployment zone and gets to possibly take first turn. Again, the night fight restriction, I don't like that, but this is much more balanced than mission 1.
The third mission is Sudden Strike, and this one here has a bit more variability in it. There are a total of 6 objectives, again, first being placed by the strategic advantage player. Standard rules, 6 inches from an edge, 12 inches from each other. But the way this works is you score victory points depending on the turn. So on game turn 1, you can't score any objectives. On game turn 2, you can score a single objective. And on game turn 3, you can score 2 objectives. So the actual maximum you can do in game turn 3 and 4 is 5 objectives, because you can only do 2 maximum here. But you do remove each of these tokens every time they're scored.
Yeah, I like this one too. Because there's 6 objective markers, it doesn't necessarily mean that the strategic advantage player has an advantage. Each player is going to get to put down 3. I like the fact that on game turn 1, you can't score an objective, so no sneaky putting your infiltrator right on an objective marker to start scoring immediately. I do like that. Yeah, this one to me is relatively more balanced compared to mission 1 as well, but the same complaints exist.
I like that these tokens are moved off the board, so there's only actually a total of 6 available for the game in the standard part of it. Then you're relying on your secondary objectives there.
Yeah, I do. I agree with you. And I think our last battle that you and I had, this is the mission that we played. So yeah, it's pretty decent. I don't want to keep beating a dead horse about night fighting and things like that. But overall, it's a decent mission.
The fourth mission is called Take and Hold. So this one here, each of the players places an objective marker in the opponent's deployment zone. So very similar to the core Onslaught rules. And again, it's at the end of each of the active player turns, you control an objective and gain a single victory point. But if you have 2, you gain 3 victory points. So you advantage to get to the other side of the field, but not the sole objective of the game.
Yeah, this one is a bit broken to me, and here's where I see it breaking, right? Because you place the objective markers, you can actually, the strategic advantage player gets to choose their deployment zone. So they can actually make it where they can score on the first turn and the other player cannot. And they can do this very easily, right? I'm going to place my marker in the other, in the other deployment zone, and I'm going to place it in a spot that absolutely cannot be, if you try to go to it, you're going to lose a lot of your units or whatever else. You place one in my zone, or vice versa. Basically, what you can do is you can manipulate the objective placement since you get to choose what deployment zone you want to go into. It's really weirdly written, right? Because it tells you that you place the objective markers in the opposing player's deployment zone, but then you deploy afterwards and pick the deployment zones. It's written so weirdly. I don't know why. Again, it contradicts itself.
Yeah, because how do you know which one the opponent's deployment zone is before the strategic advantage player has placed it? Because it says once all objectives are placed, the strategic advantage player must select a deployment zone. So yeah, I think in general what you'll find for this mission is everybody's just going to place them in very open areas because mutual destruction, I think, is the common denominator there.
Yeah, and you could do that. But like, let's say I'm running a list with a Spartan or a Land Raider. I can just basically place that as a bunker, and then right behind it I can place my scoring unit, and then I can just start scoring immediately. I just, again, it's just written so weird to me.
The final new mission is called Strike and Fade. And this one has a single objective again placed in the center, but this one deviates to d6 plus 2 inches at the very start of the game. And it must deviate. It can't stay stationary in the center of the board. Again, the caveat, if it's in impassable terrain, the strategic advantage player gets to move it so it's not in impassable terrain. But the goal here is to get control of it, but the number of victory points you earn is equivalent to the game turn you're on. And after you've earned the victory point, the objective moves d6 plus 6 inches in a random direction. This to me could be very fun to play, but also could really turn the tide if you're extremely unlucky and make it unwinnable.
Yeah, I like the fact that the objective markers move. I mean, it stops somebody from just sitting on an objective marker, where I think this one kind of can break down a bit. And again, the strategic advantage player could get a significant advantage if you happen to roll the search and destroy deployment map, which is the quarters, right? And there's this no man's land in the middle. The objective marker is placed in the middle. It deviates d6 plus 2, so potentially 8 inches. It could easily deviate close enough for the strategic advantage player to once again be scoring right from the very start, because they get to select what deployment area that they want. Other than that, I like the mission. I like the moving objective. I just think it's a bit weird that they didn't think about that, because that is a real reality, right?
Yeah, for me, I see it that if you're the first person to get it and it does deviate afterwards, say just 7 inches or even just a couple inches, but towards your army, it's facilitating you scoring another objective for the next turn at a higher point score. Then if it deviates even further into your lines, it's another 3 on the third turn. After third turn, it's impossible for the opponent to win.
Yeah, absolutely. Common theme through all of these missions, the strategic advantage player also gets, an advantage in this mission. I don't know. I think, again, we're going to have to probably review some of these, house rule them, modify them a little bit to lower that advantage, because I just think it can be quite unbalancing.
Yeah, I think that if this rule, I like the moving objective, but I think if they'd done something along what Goonhammer has, where it's 3 along the center line, that there would have been more balanced, because it still gives you a chance to get points and some of the objectives go your way. Here, it's really an all or nothing. It could go 100% against you, and no matter what you're doing, you can't do anything.
Yep, fair enough. Totally agree with you. Idea good, execution, meh.
Well, so that's everything now for our coverage of the Siege of Cthonia book. We've gone through the Zone Mortalis, we've gone through the Inducti, and now we've gone through the Onslaught Campaign and the new core missions. So, Jason, what are your thoughts of the entire book as a whole?
I think now that we've had some games under our belt, we've had time to digest the rules, and we've done these reviews. My initial opinion of the book in our one Heresy Thursday, where we talked about exactly that, it hasn't changed, right? I feel that the book is unfinished. I feel like there's consistent editing issues in certain areas. I think there's a lot of great ideas here, and I think there are some things that stick out as as nice, as good to have. So I have to give credit where credit is due. But my hope is that the future campaign books that we get for the Heresy are really looked at with the context of not kind of repeating the same mistakes that we've seen for this book. Whether it's Inducti, where some legions get massive bonuses and some get garbage, or missions that don't make sense. I think that needs to be really looked at much, much harder for the future books. I do like the fluff. I like the new content that we're getting. Again, it just feels so unfinished, or it feels like there was an editing gap somewhere.
Yeah, I'm along similar lines there. The one thing I'm hoping for moving forward for the Horus Heresy, and now that Games Workshop has taken over, is I'd honestly like them to separate the fluff parts and the rules parts and give us some really nice collectible things we can get for the fluff. But the rules to be released in more, honestly, of a PDF version that can be updated simply. Because as soon as you set it in stone in a book like this, it's very hard to do drastic changes. And if they're not going to do a significant amount of community playtesting, or if that community playtesting is inadequate, and there are still gaping holes in the rules, it just dissuades new players from spending the money to buy these books and not be able to happily use half of it.
That's a great point. I mean, and if you're a 40K player, 40K gets constant attention, whether it's through rules updates, FAQs, points changes. There's like a very robust balancing that takes place. Are we going to get that for the Heresy? I doubt it. I mean, let's face it, Heresy and 40K are on completely different levels when it comes into probably revenue, sales, etc., and I'm sure internal resources. So yes, we're not going to get those things. But I do think that we probably have to resign ourselves to the fact that you are going to have to house rule stuff. You are going to probably have to talk through things a lot with your play group. If you're blessed enough to have a play group, I don't think that we'll ever get to the kind of ecosystem that they have in 40K. And again, there's pros and cons to that as well, because you could just as easily say that kind of ecosystem in 40K invalidates people's armies and units much more frequently. So there's the good and the I don't get too fussed about a lot of this, because we do have such a good play group here that we can modify things, we can talk through things, we focus more on the narrative, less on the competitive. But I do feel for those players that don't enjoy that kind of meta or that kind of play group in their own area.
Yep, I think that honestly, as a community for the Horus Heresy players, we are quite independent ourselves and less reliant on rules from GW or Forgeworld in these cases, where we're quite happy to house rule things to make it fit the narrative, make it feel better, and not follow specifically the word of law that GW is trying to lay down here. So it'd be nicer, yes, if they got things right when they release them. Realistically, as we've said, I don't think that's possible because of the resources put towards it, and also, honestly, because of the expectation we as a community have.
Yeah, we're picky. I think all Games Workshop customers are very picky and very, very vocal. But yeah, I mean, those old Heresy hands amongst us, we're kind of used to having to do these kinds of things. But for new players, it might be a bit shocking, or for people used to 40K, it might be a bit shocking that the changes don't come more frequently, and there is a lot of ambiguity that has to be dealt with.
Well, look, I think that really rounds up our Heresy Thursday this week. We've had a good dive into the latest release by Games Workshop. Moving forward for our Heresy Thursdays, we'll be bringing you more army reviews week to week, and also coming July, we'll actually have some very special midweek releases of scenery reviews and scenery how-tos. So if you aren't subscribed yet, please subscribe to make sure you get the notifications of these exciting video releases. And please let us know if you have any comments by jotting something down in the comment section of this video or any of our videos. And we try diligently to get back to you there.
Yeah, absolutely. Keep the comments coming. I personally enjoy reading the comments. If we get something wrong, if you have a differing opinion, please give us constructive comments. We're always willing to listen. If you have suggestions on other things that you'd like to see out of the channel, don't hesitate to bring that up as well. Hopefully we can get some new releases in terms of models that they've teased to us at Warhammer Day, so that we can also bring you some reviews on that. But yes, we're very committed to continuing to bring you as much content as we can, and thanks to you for all the support.
Well, I think then all I have to say is thank you for tuning in this week. And from me, Richard, I'll be back next week.
And from Jason, as always, happy wargaming.